Our alternate history continues in spring of 1942. The United States and Soviet Union are still fighting in Alaska. The Japanese and Americans are fighting all across the Pacific. The Germans are still fighting the United Kingdom in the skies over Britain and in North Africa. The Second World War continues in all its intensity. In 1942, the American public sees the Japanese Empire as a far greater concern than the Soviets. They're not interested in Alaska and demand that the army either achieve a quick victory or make peace with the Soviets. This sentiment is shared by a large portion of the military, who also agrees that Japan should be the entire focus of the American war effort. The decision of whether to continue the war with the Soviets is about to become even more complicated due to developments in the European theater. Hitler is becoming increasingly frustrated with his Air Force's inability to break the British resistance. His generals cannot convince him to wait any longer. He wants to attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was always his goal from the beginning. Fighting the West was just a distraction, something that he thought was necessary. In late spring, the offensive begins. Just as in our timeline, the Soviet Union is shocked. They did not expect Hitler to turn on them so soon. The American government is of course very pleased with this turn of events. They begin negotiating closer ties with Germany and give Germany more access to American raw materials. This puts the United Kingdom in an extremely precarious position. They know that the United States will never join the war on their side now. They also know that if the United States is able to supply the Germans with raw materials, their military capabilities will increase exponentially. Preventing a massive flow of supplies from reaching the Germans from the United States is an existential issue for the British. Tensions between the British and Americans were already high because of the Americans' illegal movement of troops through Canada to attack Alaska. The British declare that they will use the Royal Navy to sink any merchant ships heading from the United States to Germany. It only takes days for the first incident to take place. 5 merchant ships heading from New York to Germany are intercepted by 2 British battleships. The British give the American sailors half an hour to abandon ship. The merchant ships are then sunk. The outraged US government declares that they will use the US Navy to escort any merchant ships from now on. Any interference by the British will be taken as an act of war. Meanwhile, the Canadian government begins negotiation with the Soviets. They know that if the United States turns hostile towards the United Kingdom, the only way they'll survive is with Soviet help. After days of negotiations, the first Soviet troops are secretly allowed to pass through Canadian territory to bypass American defenses in Alaska. The Canadian military itself also prepares for a preemptive strike across the entire American border. With enough Soviet assistance, the Canadians think that they might be able to do enough damage to northern American cities to be able to force a peace agreement. Seeing Canada under threat, the United Kingdom decides to move all of its forces from North Africa to Canada. Canada is far more important to them. This troop movement, however, is very noticeable. The Germans are able to overrun the rest of North Africa, and the Americans at this point know that war in Canada is unavoidable. It is now late November and the weather is getting cold. The Americans, knowing how difficult winter combat is from their experience in Alaska, do not expect the Canadians, Soviets, or British to launch any major operations on the Canadian front. They also don't plan to do anything until next spring. They are about to get a huge surprise, however. The Soviets and Canadians are far more experienced in winter combat than the Americans, and see this as the best time to attack. They know they can't face the United States in full open combat during the summer. This is their only chance. Soviet, British, and Canadian forces begin an offensive against Seattle. They hope that this will cut off all American forces in Alaska from their supplies. This would leave the 500,000 American troops in Alaska encircled and very vulnerable. Meanwhile, British bombers based in Canada bomb American industrial cities. Taken by surprise, the American military is hard-pressed to respond. The war against the Japanese suddenly takes second priority to the war on the home front. The Americans are desperate to reconnect with their forces in Alaska. They know if they don't make contact with them soon, they will run out of supplies and be captured. The loss of 500,000 men would be a devastating blow to the US military. To make matters worse for the Americans, the Australians, seeing the Canadians under threat, have decided to sever ties with the Americans and make peace with Japan. The Japanese, who are losing ground in the Pacific, are more than happy to accept. Overall, the strategy for each alliance is very simple. The Germans plan to take as much of the Soviet Union as possible and cripple their manufacturing ability. The United States is hoping to hold out long enough until Germany has destroyed the heart of the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union is knocked out of the war, the United States will easily be able to defeat all of its other enemies. The Soviets, British, and Canadians, however, have decided on an America-first strategy. They know that if they knock out the Americans, the Germans will have no hope of winning. The Soviets are betting that they can hold off the Germans long enough to defeat the United States. The war has now reached new heights of intensity. For the Soviets, Canadians, Americans, and Japanese, this is now an existential conflict. Losing would mean the loss of their home territories. The next few months will be the deciding phase of the war. If the Soviets can hold out against the Germans long enough to defeat the Americans, then the Soviets, British, and Canadians will be victorious. If the Soviets are destroyed by the Germans before then, however, all will be lost for the Soviets and they will collapse. If you've enjoyed the scenario so far and are looking forward to finding out what happens in part 3, let me know in the comments below.